Hello and welcome to episode 51 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basa. And because I went 2 weeks without doing one of these, we've got lots of questions. In fact, we've got so many questions that this may be divided up into 2 parts. Also, in future, I may have to instill some discipline, exercise some discipline, and maybe limit the number of questions down to like 5 for each person. So each person can ask a maximum of 5, or if they ask more than 5, I will reserve the right to choose the most juicy and succulent questions to answer. Otherwise, I'm not sure how we're going to manage this. I mean, once a week, I guess, is doable, but we'll just have to see how it goes. Because there are some people that, I mean, they ask lots of questions, and that's good. I mean, it's good to be curious, you know, but I'm going to have a drink of my beverage now. Also, you may have noticed that I'm not wearing my new fez, but I do have it on display back there so that those of you who are really into the fez can look over my shoulder and gaze upon it in awe and wonder. So without any further ado, because we do have lots of questions here. Well, I guess this is further ado. I mean, yeah, this is ado. This is more ado. I'm sorry. But, oh, now I forgot what I was going to say. That is so weird. So, okay, without any further ado, I'll start answering questions. And the first one is from Francois, known to some, perhaps, as Francois. And Francois says, the materialistic worldview of Western Buddhism is problematic indeed, since according to my understanding of Buddhism, it is morality or karma that shapes the universe. The Buddhist cosmogony is a hierarchy of beings and planes of existence based on karma, where the only way out is to do just enough good karma to gain ultimate wisdom and eventually transcend all karmas together. But still, the conditions of existence of all beings is a result of their karma. So morality is the only framework that actually matters. Is that a right interpretation? Well, I might put it in slightly different words, but yeah, that's I would be mostly incorrect in like agreement with that, with a few qualifiers. I mean, you can say, I mean, like Orthodox Theravada puts more emphasis on ignorance as like the foundational principle of worldly existence. So, but it's ignorance that causes karma, because if you don't have any ignorance, you don't have any karma. Like an arahant who has completely eradicated delusion, at least spiritual delusion, he's not making karma anymore. There's this one part here, the only way out is to do just enough good karma to gain ultimate wisdom and eventually transcend all karmas altogether. That, I don't know, I'd have to think about that, I guess. But, I mean, you get good karma to put yourself in a position where you can practice more effectively. But, yeah, it isn't the good karma that gets you enlightened. That in a way, that's sort of like Sila Bhatta Paramasa, where somebody thinks that morality is going to liberate them. But, yeah, in general, I would agree with this. That, you know, it's ignorance that causes karma, which is what is essentially generating this universe. And, I mean, the only way out is, I mean, yeah, it helps to do good karma, definitely. And, but eventually, it's like you're trying to, long before you gain ultimate wisdom, you're trying to like sublimate karma, make it more subtle, just because the karma, whether it's good karma or bad karma, you know, the good karma is like the up and the bad karma is the down of the roller coaster ride. So, I mean, there's a kind of transcendental good karma, which is sort of neutral karma or just subtle karma that, you know, that is more conducive to wisdom just because it produces more, you know, peace and clarity of mind. So, yeah, you know, in a way I would agree with this. I mean, mostly I would agree with this. I might use slightly different language, but yeah, it's mostly, in my opinion, you know, it's pretty much a right interpretation. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Crazy Librarian. And Crazy Librarian says, what happens if a monk's parents or family member got sick and have no one to care for them? Do monks get help to care for their parents or family? Some monks do take care of their parents. I mean, it often results in the monk disrobing. There were a few monks in Asia that I knew who went back to America because, like, for example, one of them, his mother had dementia and he wanted to take care of his mother, and then eventually he just drops out because it's hard for a monk to be a caretaker for somebody when he can't drive, he can't handle money, he's not supposed to feed himself, all this kind of stuff. So it almost necessitates breaking rules in the West, especially. I mean, if a monk in Asia, yeah, I mean, he could, if he's like a Sayadaw, like in Burma, he's sort of like a famous monk, he could get somebody to take care of them easily. But yeah, it can be problematic. And if there's nobody else to take care of the aging parents, the monk may have to choose between, his duty as a son or, his duty to practice Dhamma as intensively as he can. Because sometimes it just doesn't work out. You can't be living alone in a cave taking care of an aging parent or some, like, an invalid or, like a special needs child or something. Yeah, you're going to have to make the choice in a situation like that, I think. So, let's see, Crazy Librarian's next question. Has Buddhism ever talked about identical twins? What is the karma between two people born as identical twins? That's an interesting question. I don't remember ever seeing any mention of identical twins in, like, Theravada Buddhist literature. Presumably, I think I've read elsewhere that identical twins have like a strong, like, karmic connection with each other. They've been very close over multiple lives, which has caused that. Although I'm not sure. I mean, this would be heresy from the Theravadan point of view, but I mean, it's theoretically possible. At least it could be imagined that this could happen, and that you've got a karmic stream that just splits in two, sort of like the egg that is the progenitor of two identical twins splits in two and then produces, it just becomes like two zygotes and then turns into two people. Something similar, I suppose, could theoretically at least happen with karma, where it just kind of splits and then you got two with very similar karma that wind up being born, like genetically identical. Although, as I say, that probably would be heresy in Theravada Buddhism. Probably the correct answer, according to Theravada Buddhism, the orthodox answer would just be that you've got these two karmic streams or beings who have been strongly bonded. They got the strong karmic connection. They've been father and son, or mother and daughter, or married, or they've just been having many lifetimes where they have had this close association, and maybe they just have really, they have like this affinity where they just become so attuned to each other and so close to each other that they just get born, from the same womb at the same time, almost, genetically identical. Although they do have different karma, because identical twins, as a general rule, they don't have exactly the same personality, for example. They don't do exactly the same things. And I was recently working in a sheet metal shop with identical twins there, and I've noticed that it's usually, if you have like a more alpha of the two, he tends to be the one that was born first, or she. It might just be 10 minutes apart, but still, they get named first. Or like when you're mentioning both of them, the older one in the family at least usually is first on the list or whatever. So they're not exactly the same. But I'll just move on to the next question. And this is from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana says, I found this strange sutta from the Samyutta Nikaya 41.6, called the Dutiya Kamabutta Sutta. It is a discussion between Shita the householder and a monk, where he is asking him questions, and he asks, "But sir, when a mendicant has emerged from the attainment of the cessation of perception and feeling, how many kinds of contact do they experience?" And the monk replies, "They experience 3 kinds of contact: emptiness, signlessness, and undirected contacts. Based on my understanding, this means they make contact with the Nibbana element as soon as consciousness is booted up again. The explanation I've heard is that Nibbana existed during the cessation as well, but we only experience Nibbana when consciousness arises again. But how can they possibly know? If this is a more traditional interpretation, then what's the point of cessation if there's no consciousness experiencing Nibbana according to Orthodox tradition? The traditional view just seems like annihilationism to me, but I don't know." Well, this is all talking about... I'm going to have another drink. Just a second. This is all talking about a phenomenon called Nirodha Samapatti, or the attainment of cessation, and the cessation is of perception and feeling. And it's only attainable by very advanced saints, and it's like kind of above 4th jhana, and really it's just, in a way, just a kind of suspended animation. And I am kind of skeptical as to how far back this idea of Nirodha Samapatti goes. This sutta that he's mentioning is kind of a case in point, as it's a little bit questionable because it's not even attributed to the Buddha himself. And usually suttas that are not attributed to the Buddha himself but to some other monk or nun tend to be later. They have more like characteristics of later stuff and not earlier stuff. And so he says, how many contacts do they experience after they've emerged from the attainment of cessation of perception and feeling? And the monk replies, they experience 3 kinds of contact: emptiness, signlessness, and undirected contacts. And I think usually instead of undirected, it's like choiceless. It's and they're all more or less synonyms. Like signlessness means there's no perceptual object there. That yeah, it's kind of hard to discuss it, but yeah, I mean these emptiness, signlessness, and undirected contacts, in a way they're all describing the same state. I mean, it's sort of like the state of this cessation itself. And really, as I've discussed a number of times before, Orthodox Theravada really cannot describe Nibbana. They cannot describe the state of enlightenment very well, because they just, in a way, the scholars who came up with like Abhidhamma and the commentarial tradition especially, they're just trying to fit Nibbana into the whole scheme of samsara. It's like in Abhidhamma there are 4 main ultimate realities. You got mind, matter, mental states, and Nibbana. So that Nibbana is just on this list of other like phenomena. So they're trying to fit it into this system, and it doesn't really work that way, and they can't really describe what Nibbana is. They got rid of the whole idea of formless infinite consciousness, which was there in older texts, but as orthodoxy developed, they moved away from that. And if you ask like an orthodox monk, like some Burmese scholar Sayadaw, they'll say it is the principle of cessation is Nibbana. But I mean, cessation lasts one moment. If it lasts even that long, I mean, something's there and then it stops being there. I mean, how is that going to be like unconditioned? So they really, I mean, they didn't have like the logical sophistication of like later Mahayana philosophy, and they're attempting to describe Nibbana in essentially a samsaric way, or at least relying entirely on samsaric concepts and so forth, and it just doesn't work very well. See, so what's the question here? Let's see. But how can they possibly know if they experience Nibbana? Yeah, this is another thing of bad logic. Like, I had a discussion with a really orthodox Pa-Auk monk once, and it's like, if you're in a state of cessation, for example, how are you going to know that you are in a state of cessation? Or even, this was the question I think that I asked him. It's like, according to Abhidhamma, everything's blinking off and on at like 1 trillion times a second or 10 trillion times a second, but it's flashing off and on. Everything, including your own mind. Your own mind is flashing off and on like 17 times faster than matter. Mind is faster than matter. But, I mean, if your own consciousness is ceasing to exist, you wouldn't be aware of that. It's like it's all the non-existent parts would just cancel out. You wouldn't be aware of them because your consciousness wouldn't be operating. And this very orthodox monk said, well, you just review that. But, I mean, you can't review what you never experienced. You can't review what you never viewed to begin with. And so there's all these kind of bugs in the system that maybe in ancient times they just did not have the sophisticated logic even to catch it. Or they come up with some stopgap kind of jerry-rigged kind of explanation for it that really, it satisfies those that are, very eager to be satisfied because they've got like a vested interest in Theravada, for example. But skeptical people from outside the system, or even skeptical weird Westerners inside the system, they're just not satisfied by these answers. And like cessation, I mean, in a way, if it's cessation of perception and feeling, there could still be consciousness, but then again, Orthodox Theravada says, no, there can't be consciousness because you can't have consciousness without the perception and feeling, and volition too. So, yeah, it's, in a way, it is very similar to annihilationism. They've got Nibbana as this ultimate reality that is unconditioned and so forth, but they can't really explain it in any way other than cessation, which is pretty much annihilationism. I mean, if something ceases or it is annihilated, it's pretty much the same non-existence afterwards. So I can understand Siovakchen Sipad Zidana's confusion with regard to this kind of stuff, because it is confusing. It's just the confusion is essentially built into the system. So I'll just move on to his next question. I know you have said states above 4 jhanas probably were added later, but I've had interesting experiences with anesthesia. It's like you blink, but instead of a second passing by, 2 hours have passed, and there was nothing in between those two moments. Medical nirodha. How would you explain this from a non-materialistic perspective? It's hard to believe Nibbana can really be uncreated and undecaying based on this experience as well. I pretty much understand what he said at first, but this last part, when he actually gets to the question part, especially the second one. Oh wait, no, there's only one question mark. It's a little hard to answer. So let's see. How would you explain this from a non-materialist perspective? It would be like if your consciousness, you've got consciousness there, but it is devoid of content. Then, I mean, essentially a coma or suspended animation would be like the Nirodha Samapati that we were just discussing. I mean, probably in Nirodha Samapati also you would not be aware of the passage of time. That's what I would expect. You go into Nirodha Samapati, you're not even aware of having gone into it. I mean, how would you be aware unless there's still some kind of mentality going on? Because if all mentality ceases, then the passage of time ceases, because the passage of time is itself a mental phenomenon. I mean, time in reality, even according to like Einsteinian physics, it's the fourth dimension. It's not changing. It's just our mental system, maybe the crudeness of our mentality causes us to experience this fourth dimension in like a linear sequence, but it's not necessarily how it exists in reality. So it's hard to believe Nibbana can really be uncreated and undecaying based on this experience as well. Well, I mean, Nibbana just transcends the whole system. It's just off the scale. And trying to understand it intellectually is not going to work. It's just not going to work. But I do believe that there is an ultimate reality underlying all this symbolic stuff that we're experiencing, these mental projections. There is an underlying reality underlying the world as will and representation. And it's just, I'd be inclined to go along with a more or less Upanishadic and archaic Buddhist idea that it's just infinite formless consciousness, containing within it everything, every possibility. So in a way, it's everything and nothing, which is it's hard to explain. So I'll just move on to Siovaksha and Sipad Zidana's next question. I have read that psychopaths are born with brain wiring that basically makes them see other people the same as objects, and they lack a theory of mind which makes you see other people as sentient beings like ourselves. If this is the case, then a psychopath could have similar mental states while killing and torturing people as a child has while playing with Legos. How does karma affect them if they mentally might not have had ill will or even negative mental states when committing all these atrocities other than fear of getting caught? Well, I read one book about psychopaths, a study of the criminal mind, and not all people are born psychopaths. Some people are just like abused or neglected as children, and that turns them into sociopaths somehow. It's like they start acting out as a way of getting attention because otherwise they just get ignored by their parents. And children need a lot of attention. Those of you who have had small children know that children thrive on it. They need attention. And Mary Baker Eddy has this idea that very small children, if they don't get enough attention, they can die because they don't have the mentality to keep their own existence going. Mary Baker Eddy being an idealist who did not believe in material matter, so you have to have these minds kind of keeping this new, weak, small being in existence until it's old enough or mature enough to keep itself alive. But I've wandered away here. My answer to this would be that a sociopath or a psychopath, as Siovaksha and Sipad Zidana calls them, I assume he means essentially a sociopath, someone who has no conscience, someone who has no compassion. And some of them enjoy killing prostitutes or whatever it is that they're doing. They enjoy hurting others. So it's not like necessarily a child playing with Legos. It's not like the same mentality. But the thing is, in my opinion, my interpretation is that a sociopath is cut off from the deeper levels of consciousness. They still have a subconscious mind. They still got the deeper stuff going on, including karma. But it's like they're dissociated from it. They don't have any conscious connection with that, or even a semi-conscious connection. They're cut off from the deeper layers of their mind more than the average person. And nevertheless, those deeper layers are still there. So probably at a subconscious level, they do have like human empathy, or maybe not compassion so much, but they know what they're doing. And they're doing it anyway. They're making the bad karma anyway. Because, just because you're dissociated from the lower levels of your consciousness, or you might say the higher levels of your consciousness, that doesn't mean that they aren't still there and they aren't still operating and making karma. So that would be my answer to that one. So we'll just move on to Siovaksha and Sipad Zidana's next question. You have said hydrogen atoms might be conscious. How can it be these more primitive forms of consciousness come together and form a functioning consciousness that doesn't identify with any of the individual atoms but creates a completely new kind of consciousness like those of the senses and manifest together as a human being, but at the same time most of our body is doing things that we have no conscious awareness of besides despite being made up of these same conscious atoms. So why aren't we conscious of these as well, even if this what's happening in reality? I can't even imagine how chemical reactions between the atoms can make the consciousness continue together like this. In this sense, even the general materialist epiphenomenal explanation has no real answer and becomes an unsolvable hard problem instead. So let's see. So the actual question mark is about halfway up here. It's saying, but at the same time, most of our body is doing things that we have no conscious awareness of, besides being despite being made up of these same conscious atoms. So why aren't we conscious of these as well? Well, I mean, a human body is essentially a colony of protozoans. You know, each one of our cells is like this unicellular organism. The cell is like the unit of multicellular life, just the unit of life in general, which is one reason why viruses aren't considered to be fully alive, because they don't have a cell structure. So yeah, it's going, I guess the easiest way to answer this would be going with the analogy of a computer, that the computer, it isn't creating electricity, but it's organizing it, it's complexifying it, organizing it, and utilizing it. And the electricity itself is supposedly just individual electrons flowing through wires or circuits or whatever. And how do these individual electrons turn into all the complex stuff that computers do? So in a way, it's just like at a higher dimension of complexity, you got this higher dimension of activity going on that we can't really understand. I've thought about this just in terms of like a civilization might actually have a higher consciousness in a sense than the individual person does. And we're not aware of that either, any more than like a skin cell or even a brain cell is aware of all the complexity of our behavior and our thoughts and so forth. So it's just, I mean, there are philosophers that specialize in this, you know, how individual letters come together into meaningful sentences and entire stories and so forth, how individual atoms come together to form, what does it mean? It's like synergy, where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So this would be a synergistic thing, and you may have to find an expert on synergy to explain how our individual cells can create a functioning human that has feelings and thoughts and hopes and dreams and so forth, or how these electrochemical reactions in the brain can do likewise, or how the electrons flowing through the circuits in a computer can do something kind of similar. It's a case of synergy, I suppose, and just they're forming into a greater dimensional whole that just has so much more complexity to it that it forms its own kind of essence. I don't know how to put it. It's synergy. So I'll just move on to the next question, which is a sub-question of the previous one. Also, how does this connect to the idea of Nibbana? Is Nibbana like the most fundamental form of matter, like that of the quantum wave function or strings in string theory? Even with this, it's not clear how this would turn into the sensory forms of consciousness. I would say that Nibbana wouldn't be the quantum wave function or strings in string theory so much as it would be just like the quantum field, which contains zero energy and infinite energy simultaneously. That it's just like the basic substratum from which everything else arises. And it's also heresy. I'm sure, like I was saying earlier, Theravada really doesn't describe Nibbana that way, but they can't really describe Nibbana very well at all as some kind of reality. You know, Nibbana is described in the texts, like in the suttas, more as just sort of an ethical thing. It's just the getting free of samsara. And, you know, just freeing yourself of defilements and greed, hate, and delusion and so forth, and dukkha, and delusion, but as a kind of metaphysical state that is infinite, that is unconditioned, it's eternal, timeless. They're really not good at explaining that, and that's kind of understandable considering that you can't really explain what's completely off the scale of samsara, because explanations are by their very nature necessarily samsaric. So I'll just move on to Siovakcha and Sipad Zidana's next question. People with multiple personalities claim it's as if different people exist in their mind and different people take over as the main character and control the body at different times. Do you think this is a result of multiple karmic streams ending up in the same body? Sometimes people can develop MPD, multiple personality disorder, due to trauma. So can this lead to one karmic stream splitting into two or more? Well, I knew a person that to some degree had multiple personalities. I mean, they weren't like extremely different. It was sort of a subtle case of it. And I think just about anybody is going to have multiple personalities depending on the circumstances. You know, you're alone with your significant other, you're going to have a different kind of personality, usually in most people, than you're going to have when you're at work or when you're standing in line at the grocery store or whatever. So, I mean, sometimes you can be in a weird, silly mood, and sometimes you're serious. Or like another good case is some people, they have a certain personality that may be very restrained, and then they get drunk and just turn into a monster. You know, they just become completely uninhibited, just anything goes. You know, they're getting in fights and all this stuff, which they wouldn't do if they were sober. So I think that just about everybody has like different compartments or just sort of different modes that they shift back and forth into, which in a way are sort of like branches of the karmic stream that are still connected. And I think that a person with multiple personalities would just be a more extreme example of that. So much so that they're kind of, the different strands are dissociated from each other. But in a sense, a person who's throwing a raging conniption is pretty much dissociated at that time from the calmer elements of his own personality. So I wouldn't say that multiple personalities is necessarily, except in maybe some really rare extreme cases, a case of more than one being inhabiting the same body, except maybe in cases of like possession. And Buddhism does acknowledge the existence of possession. So it could be that, although I'm pretty sure that multiple personality disorder is considered to be a kind of neurotic hysteria. Maybe neurosis is obsolete now, but it's a kind of hysteria, which is below the level of psychosis. You know, it's not like you're really crazy, except unless like maybe really advanced, like extreme cases like that old movie Sybil, based on a book starring Sally Field, I think it was. I mean, that's a pretty extreme case, and yeah, it's possible, but getting into extreme cases like that, I mean, I'm no expert on them. I don't have any personal experience with cases like that. So I'll just stick with what I've already said and move on to the next question. Did you ever become fluent in Burmese? How well did you end up in your conversational skills in the language, and how long did it take? I became about as fluent in Burmese as like a 7-year-old kid. You know, I could speak Burmese about as well as maybe a 6 or 7-year-old Burmese kid. With regard to basic stuff, you know, I had it pretty much down. But with regard to unusual stuff that I didn't talk about generally, like fixing cars or politics or something, you know, there's this jargon that I just never learned. And I never really picked up much on just the slang, like the idiom kind of stuff. Every once in a while I'd be accused of talking like a dictionary or a book, because I just try to, you know, say literally what I meant and just completely be oblivious to these common idioms that everybody uses except me. How well did you end up? Yeah, okay. And how long did it take? It took maybe a couple years in my case, but I've never been very good at foreign languages. I met a few people. There was this one European nun who was pretty much fluent within just a matter of a few months. Some women especially, I think women are better at learning foreign languages than men are in general, on average. And so someone who really has a knack for picking up foreign languages, Burmese really is not a very difficult language, except for the pronunciation. Like the vocabulary is not all that big. It doesn't have like weird verb forms and just things like, you know, like is, was, were, you know, that kind of thing they don't have, or like good, better, best. You know, in Burmese it would be good, more good, most good, which is, you know, makes perfect sense. So really the only really difficult thing about learning Burmese, you know, it's a relatively simple language, but the difficult thing is the pronunciation, because Burmese has sounds that are not differentiated in English. Like Mokonde means it's very rainy. Mokonde with like a harder K means it's a drought. So you can have almost exactly the same sentence with just one little difference, and it's the exact opposite in meaning. And if you say the wrong thing, it's people will look at you like you're speaking Greek. I knew this one Australian monk who, because the word for need, lo, is almost exactly pronounced the same as the worst cuss word in the Burmese language, that he just wouldn't ever say the word need. He was afraid of accidentally just cussing and causing some young woman to start crying or something. So it's pretty easy to learn if you're good at foreign languages. So I'll just move on to the next question here. From CO Vaksh and Sipad Zidana. Also, how has Burmese culture changed you as a person after living among them all those years? Yeah, it's kind of a subtle thing, but it's a good question. How it had living in Burma for more than 20 years, more than a third of my life, how has that affected me? I think one of the main ways that it affected me is that when you're living in a very different culture from the one you were born and raised in, then it's almost like taking psychedelic drugs for the first time, where you're seeing that there's other ways of looking at reality. Because we're all human, so we're more similar than different. A Burmese villager is, more similar than different to some American urbanite. But still, there's just basic assumptions. There's the whole, metaphysic of existence. They're in a way, to some degree, like pre-scientific. They still have kind of a medieval attitude. So that in some ways they come closer to like a medieval European, like from the 14th or 15th century, than they would, a modern or postmodern European. Especially you get out into the remote village areas. Maybe in the cities, there's definitely some difference, but so that's one thing. Is just you're exposed to a very different way of going about life, and a very different way of looking at life. And so it gives you a certain amount of perspective. You realize that Western scientific materialism or scientific realism isn't the only possible way of looking at reality. And most Western Buddhists, they still just assume that Western objectivity is just a given. That's just how you look at life. And it's not necessarily so. And another way that living in Burma has affected me is Burmese villagers, especially the last, the villages I lived near the longest, which was Lamye village and Wunbo village. The people there are just abnormally moral and virtuous and modest people. So much so that a Westerner might be skeptical that such people could exist. But you see how just simplicity of life plus just accepting Buddha Dharma just without question, it causes not necessarily utopia, but still it's a better way of living than the messed up way that most Westerners live their lives. So there's that too. I've come to appreciate that, and I have a lot of respect for the Burmese. I can criticize certain things about them, but at the same time I have to acknowledge that as a general rule, they're better people than we are, just because they're not so distracted by all this artificial crap going on, and also they just accept Dhamma without question. They just know that it's true. And there are probably other things too, but I got more questions to answer here, so I'll just move on to the next question. How do you square the idea of liminality and the law of dependent origination? Based on my little understanding, it seems like dependent origination would exclude the possibility of liminality, and psychic powers and the paranormal would still work based on causes and conditions, but I don't know. Yeah, that is a good point. I mean, dependent origination would still exist because anything that exists is dependently co-arising. It's just that when the structure of the dependent co-arising is sort of weakened or sort of destabilized, that destabilizes what is possible. So I get what Siovaksha and Sipad Zidana is getting at, although in order for anything at all to exist, it's dependently co-arising. But it's not just like it's like unavoidable determinism. The Buddha dismissed determinism also. So you can't just have like this mechanistic, this necessarily causes this, which necessarily causes that. That also is rejected by Buddhism. So dependent origination is more subtle than that. You know, it's a way of explaining how all this stuff happens, including this weird like synchronicities and so forth. But it would be, the weird synchronicities would come like really sort of like a weak spot in the network of causes and conditions. But still, it has its own causes and conditions. It's just that, you know, it's more variable or something. I'm sorry I didn't answer that like with total mastery, but it is kind of a weird idea that I'd never really thought about much before. But anything that exists is going to be, anything that has a beginning and an end is dependently co-arising, including anything that arises through, you know, creating liminality through violating taboos and so forth. So I'll just move on to the next question, and this is from Yuga-u. I think that's how to pronounce it. The people that ask questions, they got weird names sometimes. So anyway, Yuga-u says, tell me about the karma that is conditioned by place. I find myself singing a specific song on a specific place in the city, even though I was not there for a long time. Ever encountered such a phenomenon? Is that why Buddha can only arise on the Indian continent? Well, the karma that is conditioned by place, still, I mean, it's a mental state. And so what would happen would be, you know, if you have certain mental states in a certain place, I assume that would just be that the conditions of that place are affecting your mind and your volitions, which is then eliciting the song or whatever it is. I mean, there are some people that believe that places have their own karma. Like the Middle East has just been a battlefield, you know, since prehistoric times. That's probably one reason why walled cities were invented in that general area, apparently. Is just because people realized that if they built walls around their village, then they were less likely to get killed by barbarians. So in a case like that, it's still the mental states. It's still, I mean, the mental states are the karma. And so certain areas may have certain effects on mental states. You know, like a hot area may cause significantly different effects on mental states than a cold area. You know, like some barren wasteland is going to cause significantly different mental states than, you know, New York City. So there's going to be differences in that regard. And because we're all human, they might have similar effects on humans in general. But I think that's how I would explain it. And then the next part of this question here, is that why Buddha can only arise in the Indian continent? I think that the idea that Buddha can only arise in an Indian culture is due to the ethnocentric ideas of the Indians who came up with Orthodox Buddhism, Buddhist tradition. It arose in India, and it was just very India-centric. People were largely ignorant of any other cultures existing outside of India. They might have had a really hazy idea of barbarian tribes on the borders, like the Persians and the Greeks, and certain like Iranic people, like the Cambodians, I think, spoke an Iranian language. So yeah, I think the whole idea that the Buddha can only arise on the Indian continent is based on just the kind of ignorance of other continents. That Jambu Dipa, or India, was considered to be essentially the center of the world, and I think a lot of a lot of cultures are similar. You know, the Greeks considered Delphi to be the center of the world. I think the Romans eventually considered the Mediterranean to be the center of the world, because Mediterranean literally means middle of the world. So, you know, some American Indian tribe in like what is now Kansas probably considered, you know, some hill in Kansas to be the center of the world. But I mean, you could argue that a Buddha could only arise in something like an Indian culture, because an Indian culture is a dharmic culture. But I'm skeptical of that. I think a Buddha could arise in a non-Indian culture. He might be called something other than a Buddha, though. Because, of course, Buddha is a word in an Indian language. So I'll just move on to Yuga U's next question. Are stories behind the Dhammapada saying true? Because there are some really unbelievable ones, like the one with pancakes. I don't recall the Dhammapada commentary story involving pancakes, but yeah, I mean, from a Western point of view, it's extremely unlikely that the Dhammapada commentary is objective history. You know, you've got talking animals, you've got all this stuff going on. Just a lot of it's like Aesop's fables. And I mean, I assume a lot of stories in there are based on true, you know, historical events, you know, just objectively true. But for the most part, there's all this sort of magical thinking and folklore stuff, and adopting stories from, you know, like earlier traditions, incorporating them, like the Jataka stories are similar to the Dhammapada stories in certain ways, and a lot of them were like, you know, fables that were already well known before the Buddha's time, that were sort of recruited into Buddhism by just adding on some Buddhism at the beginning and some Buddhism at the end, and turning it into a Buddhist story with like a Buddhist moral. So yeah, the Dhammapada, in my opinion, is really not objective history. I mean, you've got like animals with human intelligence, for example, that, you know, I've had Burmese monks try to argue that in the Buddhist time animals did have human intelligence, but I don't think so. So we'll just move on to the next question, and this is from the person who used to have an easily pronounceable name, and now it's CHRZASZCZ, and then he added another name after that, which is TRZCINOWY. And these might be genuine Polish names or something, but I'm clueless with regard to how actually to pronounce them. So, Chirgazakis, his first question is, what happened to your hand, Tyler Durden? And I guess he noticed in the last Q&A that I had a kind of a sore on my hand. It's almost healed now. You can still kind of see kind of a pinky area there. But no, I didn't put lye on my hand and watch it burn my skin like in Fight Club. It was I was digging up some posts that were in the ground with big globs of cement, like holding them in the ground, and I was having to dig them up because we're going to put we were going to put gravel there and make it like a parking area for another car, which we've already done. But I was just like working with a shovel trying to get these things out of the ground, and I got blisters on this hand because I wasn't wearing gloves. So I'll just move on to Chirzax's next question here. In the last Q&A, you said that there are no stupid questions, there are just stupid people. Care to share a few names? For example, as a European, I think your former George W. was an idiot, and it's just my personal opinion, but if from 350 million Americans, the best you can do is George W. or Trump or Hillary or Biden, then there is something wrong with your country. Yeah, well, I mean, that can apply to just about any country, I suppose. It is true that in recent decades, we haven't had very many presidents that really have been top notch. You know, you could hardly say that any president we've had, you know, in the last 100 years has been, you know, really the best qualified person for the job. That a lot of, even though America is supposedly largely a classless society, you still have a kind of ruling elite. and the Bushes definitely, and Hillary Clinton, they kind of started their own syndicate or dynasty or something. And I mean, Trump was definitely among the financial elite anyway. And yeah, Biden, I mean, and anyone who looks at Biden with like objectivity can see that probably more than half the country would be more qualified to be the leader of America than that guy, especially nowadays when he's obviously senile. But the question is, care to share a few names with regard to stupid people? No, I don't want to be naming stupid people here. They might be watching, So we'll just move on to the next question. And these are from Jeremy, and Jeremy just kind of, sometimes he'll have like a running commentary as he's watching the video. He'll be typing in stuff, and it could be rhetorical questions. I don't know if Jeremy's actually expecting answers from these questions, but what the hell? There's question marks, and it's in the comments to a Q&A video, so what the hell? Jeremy says, entropy is an example of impermanence, is it not? This is from something I was saying about reconciling like physics with Dhamma. And yeah, I'd say that entropy is a kind of impermanence. In fact, I read this book a long time ago where it was arguing that entropy is really what causes time to move in one direction. That, because entropy always is moving in one direction. It's sort of like the arrow of time that is causing time to move in a certain direction. So, but that's beyond Dhamma. Even Abhidhamma doesn't try to account for the passage of time. Yeah, entropy would be an example of impermanence. Yeah. So we'll just move on to Jeremy's next question. Is not the eightfold path the method to become enlightened? Is that not the path to Nibbana or enlightenment? Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point, question mark. As far as I know, it is the only path to enlightenment, exclamation point. Well, you can say there's a path that like increases your odds of becoming enlightened, but the Noble Eightfold Path doesn't end at the gates of Nibbana. The Noble Eightfold Path is samsaric, it is in samsara, and Nibbana is not. So there's no connection between this path leading to samsara, or this path that is in samsara leading to enlightenment, allegedly, and enlightenment itself. So it's like Krishnamurti used to say, you can open the window, but you can't cause the wind to blow in. And in the suttas themselves, like in the Satipatthana Sutta, there's no guarantee. You can, if you practice Satipatthana wholeheartedly for as little as 1 week, you're guaranteed of enlightenment or an advanced state of sagehood. So, I mean, even then there's really no guarantee, because it's going to be one or the other according to the text itself. So, yeah, I'm reminded of Nisargadatta Maharaj, who really emphasized the idea that there are no paths to enlightenment, that you follow a path which, if it's a good path, causes your mind to become clearer and more subtle and to have fewer attachments. But no matter how many times you sweep the floor, there's still going to be a little bit of dust. I mean, you're never going to get yourself completely, absolutely perfect, although that also is a Theravadan heresy. But the thing is, you just have to get as clear as you can for finally the liberating insight to occur. And some people will have to go farther down the path than others. Some people will have to master fourth jhana before they can get enlightened. Most people probably even then won't get enlightened. Other people apparently don't have to practice meditation at all, or if they do, it's like first jhana or something, and that's good enough. Like the whole Mahasi method is based on the idea that you don't have to attain jhana or even access concentration in order to become enlightened. They say that Kanika Samadhi, momentary concentration, is good enough. So that's kind of controversial. That caused this big controversy back in the 1950s between like conservative Sri Lankan monks and the Mahasi people. So you can say the Eightfold Path is a method that facilitates becoming enlightened, probably better than any other method. But still, there's no guarantee. And if you follow that path, you can follow it forever, and you're never going to arrive at the pearly gates of Nibbana. You just follow the path until you don't need to follow it anymore, and then you just let go of it. So we'll just move on to Jeremy's next question. Concerning science and Western thought, did the Buddha know the earth was round? And if he didn't, then does it matter? To me, it does not when he teaches about the mind that maybe when it comes to cosmology or physical sciences, I don't know. Yeah, did the Buddha know that the earth was round? Well, technically the earth isn't even round. I mean, if you think in 2 dimensions, the earth is pretty much flat. You know, it's kind of a lumpy, curved surface maybe, but in 2 dimensions to say that it's flat isn't like really wildly wrong. If you think in 3 dimensions, it's a sphere, or roughly a sphere. It's not perfectly spherical, but what happens if you think in 4 dimensions? You know, you include time as the 4th dimension, you've got this 4-dimensional, like a solid cylinder that's kind of blurry at both ends. At the beginning end of the earth, it's coalescing dust and gases and so forth, and then at the other end is being vaporized when the sun goes nova, or whatever is going to happen. So you got this more or less solid earth with, you know, liquid metal core and so forth, but it's stretched out into this very, very long kind of a twisty cylinder that's kind of spinning and twisting through space like a corkscrew maybe. And then you get into 5 dimensions, you know, who knows, it'd be sort of, if like probability, or like the 5th and 6th dimensions, you might have like this whole web work. The earth is shaped like this multi-dimensional cauliflower or something. So, but getting back to the question of whether the Buddha knew the earth was round, I mean, who knows what the Buddha knew? I don't think it really matters though, because I mean, the earth isn't really round, because ultimately the earth does not exist as this discrete entity, that it's all based on delusion. I mean, the samsaric universe is based on ignorance. So you get rid of the ignorance, and it's sort of like waking up from the dream. The dream stays the dream, I suppose, but you're just not really involved in that anymore. So I don't think it's really necessary for him to know the samsaric details of, you know, what the earth is like and so forth, because it's ultimately illusory anyway, or based on delusion. So I'd be surprised if the Buddha could speak fluent Chinese, that kind of thing. I mean, according to Orthodox tradition, he knew whatever he wanted to know. So if a Chinese pilgrim came to him, he supposedly, according to the texts, he would be able to speak with him in fluent Chinese. But yeah, I really don't think omniscience or enlightenment really works that way. Just because you're enlightened doesn't mean you're going to be able to figure out, you know, like complex trigonometry. You know, it just doesn't work that way. To some degree, you just go along with what your culture says, and your enlightenment, you know, your eradication of delusion and ignorance is at a whole different level. That samsara is just kind of irrelevant to that. You know, you're seeing the ultimate reality, so what difference does it make what this dream world is like? So I think I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Rui. We're already up to about an hour. Rui says, the Buddha Dhamma and its various iterations entered the West via the intellectual caste and seems to be mostly ensconced there. Do you think this will remain so for the foreseeable future? I mean, that's the way Buddhism traditionally has like taken over other cultures, or, you know, has found its way into other civilizations, is mainly through the intellectual class, you know, the intelligentsia, and also just the ruling class. So when monks start being, you know, endorsed and favored and supported by kings and prime ministers and generals and so forth, then they get their foot in the door, and then it's sort of a top-down kind of a thing. And in the past, the top-down spread of Buddhism worked because Buddhism was, you know, it had adopted a lot of traditional Indian beliefs, and, you know, traditional village people can accept, what was designed for traditional village people. But in the West, most Westerners just aren't going to eat up with a spoon like Jataka stories and Buddhist devotionalism and so forth. Some will. There's always going to be some that just by their temperament, they're drawn to something like that. And, it might be that they're living on the edge anyway. They're just, something in their personality just makes them reject whatever is mainstream and want something different. So Buddhism in the West does attract a lot of sort of eccentric types, as you may imagine. But in order for it to really become mainstream, there's going to have to be something there that is attractive to the average Joe. The guy who's working in a plywood mill, he's got bills to pay, he's got a wife and kids. You're going to have stuff in Buddhism that a person who's not particularly spiritual can just accept as their religion, sort of like Christianity has done. And until that happens, and I doubt that it's going to be any kind of orthodox Theravada or any kind of orthodox anything that exists as it exists today. Otherwise you're going to have what's already happening with regard to Theravada, where you just have some elements of Buddhism like mindfulness techniques that just get absorbed into the culture, and most of the rest of it just gets ignored. But that wouldn't really be called Buddha Dhamma. It'd just be called, certain elements of Buddha Dhamma. So, I think it will remain so for the foreseeable future until some kind of dumbed down or less spiritually exalted version of Theravada is devised, or of Buddha Dhamma is devised, that appeals to the average Joe. And thus far, it hasn't happened yet, and I'm not sure what kind of form it would take. I assume there would have to be some kind of charismatic innovator who comes along, preferably who is, highly attained, who can come up with something like that. And he'd probably have to be a Westerner. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Rick. And Rick says, what is your most prized possession? And I don't know, I've had trouble with prized possessions before. I've had this whole issue going on with prized possessions, my most prized possession, because whatever is my most prized possession gets destroyed. I remember a long time ago when I was in college, I found some clay by a creek bank, just natural clay there, and I got some of it, and I fashioned this little pipe, for smoking controlled substances. And I made it just the way I wanted it. And then there was a kiln at work, so I baked it in the kiln. This was my most prized possession. It was just the perfect little pipe. And then one day my roommate and I were smoking it, and his girlfriend figured he'd had enough, so she tries to wrestle it out of his hands and broke the thing. And that's just the way it has always been with my most prized possession. One time when I was in Burma, just as a kind of defense against this, I declared my most prized possession to be a plastic disposable razor cap that I stuck onto my razor, when I travel with it, so the blade wouldn't knock up against things. And that was my most prized possession. It was this really neat little thing that I was using on my razor. And then I was staying at this house in Rangoon, and the servant girl there thought it was garbage and threw it away. So even just out of self-defense, I declare a plastic razor cap to be my most prized possession. It gets destroyed. So I'm hesitant to declare anything my most prized possession, because it becomes even more subject to impermanence than the average possession. Although that fez is a damn good fez. So I'll just move on to Rick's next question. What is your greatest or most persistent fear? I'm starting to think that Rick here is some kind of agent. What is your greatest or most persistent fear? I ask Rick here, have you ever read 1984? Remember that scene where Winston is in bed with his girlfriend Julia? They've got this place out in the Pearl Quarter where they meet secretly. They have these secret rendezvous, and he's telling her what his most horrible fear. And it turns out there's like a microphone, like a view screen hidden in the room because the government's spying on him. And then they use that when he's being tortured, when he's being forced to be indoctrinated and so forth. And so, I mean, you just don't blurt out in public what your most persistent fear is. I really can't think of much anyway, but even if I could, I'm not going to be just blurting it out for, the people at Google to find out and record and send to the government, whatever. So I'll just move on to the next question. And I just advise people, just don't tell anybody what your greatest or most persistent fear is. Or actually, all right, I'll do it. My greatest or most persistent fear is to be tied down, spread eagle, and to have a beautiful woman with large breasts smother me with her titties, which would have to be my sweetheart at present, for the foreseeable future, for the rest of my life, I trust. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is also from Rick. Do either you or your sweetheart desire to bear a child someday? Well, we're getting a little too old for that sort of thing. I mean, she is still of childbearing age, technically. But, yeah, I mean, having children, I'm pushing 60. So I'm getting a little too old even to be a grandpa at this point. So, yeah, the window for that was opened and closed, and neither of us took advantage of that open window. So we just have each other, plus a few dogs, and some really nice loaches out in the pond, out in the front yard. So I'll just move on to the next question here. I've heard you talk about your father on many occasions. Can you give us a summary of your mother and her influence on you? Well, I think my mother's main influence on me has been genetic, as you may imagine. That physically and emotionally, I take more after my mother's side of the family, whereas intellectually and spiritually, I take more after my father's side of the family. And my mother was spiritually a child. She just didn't get it. She got her values from like daytime TV shows, crime dramas, and so forth. She watched a lot of TV. She was a conscientious mother. She did her best. She really, I mean, in her own way, she was as good of a mother as she could possibly be towards my brother and me. But we started being on different planets when I reached about the age of 13. So, yeah, I don't want to give like a biography of my mama at this point, mainly because there's so many questions to answer. So, yeah, the main thing about that is her influence on me was largely genetic. I've got a lot of her emotional and physical traits, like long legs, this nose. So I'll just move on to the next question here. How did you go about becoming a published author? Any advice for those who may wish to publish a book? Well, with regard to the ones that cost money, I just self-published it on Amazon, and that's relatively easy to do. You can look that up. Just look up, Amazon self-publishing, and it's actually a pretty good deal. That it's relatively fair the way they go about it. With regard to my Atakawaga translation, it was just somebody who had connections with a publishing firm really liked it and wanted it published, and so they started publishing it up until they found out that I was just a heretical rascal, and so they pulled out of the deal after publishing some sample copies. So I'll just move on to Rick's next question. What are your thoughts on the story of Jesus? It is written that Pilate found no fault in him. Do you agree? It's hard to say exactly what happened in the trial of Jesus. I think I've read that that the story was monkeyed with a bit in order to blame the Jews, as the Christians were trying to distance themselves from the Old Testament Jews to some degree. But it seems to me that Jesus was put to death by the Roman government as a political criminal. It is a good chance, he was turned in by, the Jews of the Sanhedrin. But I think the Romans probably considered anyone being declared king of the Jews. And according to the gospel, according to John, I think, there was a sign on the top of his cross saying "King of the Jews," and that's why he was killed. Not because he was claiming to be the son of God. I mean, the Romans really didn't care about that sort of thing. But anyone declaring to be, a king of this rebellious group of Roman citizens, or just Roman subjects, that anyone being claimed, even if he wasn't doing it himself, if you got crowds of people considering him to be this king of a province that the Romans themselves were governing, they weren't going to put up with that. So he was killed as a political criminal, and crucifixion was a punishment, a capital punishment for political criminals, and also like pirates and bandits, renegade slaves like Spartacus, or at least the followers of Spartacus. So, I mean, what are my thoughts on the story of Jesus? I've written like multi-part blog posts and talked about this on videos. So I could talk for half an hour on the story of Jesus. I mean, it is interesting to me that everyone, whether you're a Christian or not, anyone in the West should read the Bible, just so you know what it is you're rejecting at the very least. It has such a profound influence on Western civilization, even for non-Christians. So the bare minimum, what I consider to be likely, Jesus, his mother was not a virgin. He had brothers and sisters. He was raised as a carpenter, following his father's footsteps, and he was a spiritually gifted person. Being a carpenter in a small town just wasn't doing it for him. He heard about John the Baptist out in the desert. He goes out and becomes like a disciple of John the Baptist. And while he's out there, he has this experience. He has like this awakening experience, and he finds that he has psychic powers or the ability to do miracles. Then John the Baptist is arrested. Jesus, very plausibly, I think, becomes the leader of the group after John the Baptist is gone. And then he's just not satisfied with being out here in this desert area. He wants to go where the action is. He wants to go and preach the kingdom of heaven in the towns, in the villages, and so forth. So he goes his own way. He's got followers like I think it's the Gospel of John again, who says that many of his disciples were originally disciples of John. The other Gospels say they were just fishermen mending their nets, and Jesus says, "Come with me," and they just drop their nets and follow him. But according to the Gospel of John, they were already disciples of John the Baptist, and then they switched over to Jesus when John the Baptist was arrested and decapitated. And I do think that Jesus considered himself to be the Jewish Messiah, not the Christian Messiah, but the Jewish Messiah, because it was just in the air. You read like the book of Daniel, which was written just less than 200 years before the time of Jesus. And also there's like all this apocalyptic literature that was in fashion around Jesus's time and a little before Jesus's time, that it's like predicting that there's going to be this more of a spiritual Messiah than the Old Testament King Messiah, the descendant of King David, who's going to rule Israel and lead it to the foremost position among the nations and so forth. And I think that Jesus really, because he was able to have these psychic powers and so forth, I think there's a good chance he really did believe that he was the chosen one. And then when he gets crucified and realizes that he's not going to be leading the nations like the Messiah was supposed to, that's why he cried out, my God, why have you abandoned me?" So that's it in a nutshell, and I'll move on to Rick here's next question. It seems that you are at least somewhat familiar with the Bible. Can you talk about some things within the Bible that have been helpful to you on things that you agree with, and also the contrary? One of my favorite parts of the Bible that really isn't mentioned much in Buddhism, but I think it's a good idea, is, I'm talking about the New Testament here, is that when you do good deeds, keep them a secret. Don't just go around advertising your good deeds. Like in Burma, people donate something to a monastery. They've got like this plaque with their name on it. And it's not the best idea. You're better off just, almost like, a thief conceals his actions. A person who's doing good should just do it. I mean, you're not doing it for fame in this world. You're trying to be gathering up treasures in heaven, so to speak. So, I mean, God will know, and from the the Christian point of view. So that's one thing that I really like. And the other things, and there have been other things, but they're just not coming to mind right now. And with regard to things that have not been helpful, I don't know if there have been any teachings of the Bible, Old or New Testaments, that have been like harmful to me. I mean, most of it is just irrelevant to me. I mean, I really don't care what Mosaic law is, or the Exodus through Sinai and all that. I mean, like destroying the I don't know, these different tribes. The names are escaping me, like Amalekites and so forth. I mean, some of the history is interesting, and I mean some of the stories are interesting, but for the most part, I really didn't get a whole lot of wisdom from reading the Old or New Testaments. I mean, the Old Testament, if you condense it down to one sentence, it's love the Lord thy God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength, or he will kill you, and maybe your family and neighbors too. I mean, that's like the central message of the Old Testament as far as I can tell. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is also from Rick. And I'm warning Rick that we may have to limit the number of questions down to like 5, just to keep this at a manageable length. So his next question is, how do we reconcile the Buddha telling us to wander alone like a rhinoceros and to brave bugs and snakes and heat and rain with the modern day monastic life, which is safe and social and vaccinated, and as you put it, monks living like neutered house cats? Well, I mean, you don't really reconcile it. I mean, the way you reconcile it is just acknowledging that a lot of Buddhism is in a degenerate state, and it probably has been almost from the very beginning. That, the cushy monastic cloistered life, which pulls a monk out of the wandering through the forest and just gives him, free room and board, and he knows where his next meal is coming. He knows where he's going to sleep that night. Everything's easy for the most part, unless he's really still trying to meditate at least. Yeah, I mean that's just human nature, that you've got the middle path between self-indulgence and self-torture. Most people, including most monks, are going to be straying towards the self-indulgence side. So, I mean, if you want to reconcile that in a positive way, you just acknowledge that, the monks who are just kind of lazy and living an easy life, they're there, but you don't have to do it that way. You can really do your best to follow what it says in the texts, and, live alone in the forest and just diligently practice, follow the Vinaya rules and so forth. So that'd be how you reconcile them, I suppose. I mean, you don't just necessarily live the way they live, because really, I think that was one of the most effective parts of the monk's life in the Buddhist time, was just throwing yourself at the mercy of the universe and just wandering around in a predominantly non-Buddhist, although still spiritual culture. And, you're dealing with all this stuff, bandits and tigers and malaria and all this stuff that's going on. And, I mean, just having to maintain equanimity in just really dire situations sometimes, I think that would be one of the strongest aspects of Buddhist practice. And probably one of the strongest aspects of early Christian practice, when Jesus is telling his disciples to just wander around. Oh, I just hit something. Just wander around with no money and so forth. So that'd be my answer to that. Moving on to Rick's next question. As a layman, do you still refrain from killing bugs and pests? Do you think it really matters either way, or has the principle been taken too far? After all, mosquitoes are the number one killer of human beings, apparently responsible for over 700,000 human deaths per year. Is it fair to say that we didn't make the rules of the game and that we are natural enemies? Some would argue that killing mosquitoes save human lives. Yeah, I mean, I've had falciparum malaria 7 or 8 times. I'd be dead 7 or 8 times over if it wasn't for the magic of modern day pharmaceuticals. As a layman, I do occasionally kill parasitic insects. That's the only beings whose lives I take willingly and willfully is parasitic insects, which includes ants sometimes, because they infest the kitchen sometimes. I'll just squish one with my finger if I see it on the counter. And one reason for that is, in a way, it's like an Indian cultural thing. And another thing is, I mean, it's nice if you're able to not kill any beings, but if you're a lay person living in the world, let's say you've got a kid that's got lice in his hair. I mean, you have to do something about that. Even monks that have intestinal worms, they'll still take something to get rid of the intestinal worms. You have to look after yourself. Even a monk is allowed to strike out in self-defense. So, I mean, as a layman, I'm a man. I do have, the right to defend myself and just prevent my kitchen from swarming with ants, for that matter. So, yeah, I do kill the occasional insect. It's not like a daily occurrence or anything. But one reason why I really don't think it's all that horrible, I don't think anyone's going to go to hell for that, is that I do have a degree in biology, and I know that insects and other arthropods just do not have a nervous system like ours. Apparently, they do not feel pain or fear. Like, I've told this story before. I used to work on Japanese ships as a fisheries observer in the Bering Sea before I was a monk. And on some ships, I'd have a holding tank for crabs. If a crab came up, that I'd put it in this holding tank until I had time to measure it and weigh it, say what species, what sex, I almost said gender, and its viability. See if it was likely to live, if it had arms or legs broken off, that kind of a thing. And sometimes a crab would come up that had almost all of its legs broken off. I have one leg on one side and 2 legs on the other side, and it's still alive. You toss it into the holding tank, it's full of seawater, and it just kind of moves around. If it sees a piece of squid bait, a piece of raw squid down there, it'll just stop and start eating it. It's like it doesn't really care that it just had most of its legs crushed and ripped off. I mean, you do that to a mouse, you rip off 3 of a mouse's legs, you hold a little cracker in front of it, it's just going to go into convulsions and die. It's not going to want to eat anything. But insects and crustaceans and so forth, it's like they don't feel pain. It just doesn't seem to bug them. No pun intended. A mosquito or a fly will fly away if you're trying to slap it, but that's just like an automatic reflex, sort of like the door at the grocery store opening when you walk towards it. The door doesn't get out of your way because it's afraid of you. It's just programmed to do that. So it's not like I'm endorsing the killing of insects. If you can go without killing insects, if you can go without killing living beings, that's fine. I mean, if it's a nice, mostly if it's a cockroach or a spider or something, it's just one. I'll catch it with a cup and then a piece of cardboard and let it go outside. But I do have the right to defend myself. And also it's sort of a man's duty to deal with the icky bugs and stuff when you've got a woman that doesn't want to deal with icky bugs. So, yeah, I freely admit that I occasionally kill an insect. And even when I was a monk, I occasionally killed an insect on purpose. So we'll just move on to the next question here. What are your thoughts on the practice of circumcision? Well, I'm circumcised. I won't show you. No worries. But, yeah, I was circumcised. I think most guys in America of my generation have been circumcised. I really am kind of neutral on the subject. I really don't have an opinion about it one way or the other, to tell you the truth. Yeah, I really don't care. So I'll just move on to the next question. Do you see a similarity between Catholic monastic life and Buddhist monastic life? It seems rather unnatural to isolate oneself with the same sex and live a celibate life. Do you think there is some possible common root, or perhaps Catholicism borrowed from earlier Eastern tradition, or did they spring up entirely separate? Well, it's hard to say for sure. I think Buddhism did have some effect on Western religion, this very indirectly maybe, that there were Buddhist missionaries that were sent by Ashoka into the Hellenistic world, the Greek speaking world of the West. Also, Alexandria, Egypt, they have found like little Buddha images and stuff there, because you had trade routes between India and the Roman Empire coming through Alexandria, and almost certainly you'd have practicing Buddhists from India living there. And so probably they knew about Buddhism, at least maybe not the average person living in a village in Gaul or something, but like the intelligent, educated people probably had at least heard of Buddhism. There were some Greek philosophers who traveled to India and came back, and so whether Catholic monastic orders got their ideas from Buddhism, and to what extent, I mean, it's possible. I don't think there's any way of proving it one way or the other, but it is a possibility. And isolate oneself with the same sex and live a celibate life is unnatural. But then again, if you're trying to escape from the natural world and enter into, some transcendent state, you pretty much have to go against nature to a large degree. So it is possible they just came up with this stuff independently. I think there were some Jewish sects. There were the Essenes. There was another group called the Therapeutae, something like that, who they were like quasi-monastic orders. They were celibate and so forth. And also, like, some of the first like Christian ascetics were the desert fathers of Egypt, and that's close to Alexandria. Alexandria was in Egypt, so it could be that there was some Buddhist influence, but you can't really say for sure. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here, and this question is from Moo88. And Moo88 says, what is the funniest thing you experienced while living in Burma? And that's hard to say. I mean, with regard to laughing hard, probably the hardest I ever laughed. I mean, this may be kind of a disappointment, for people expecting something exotic, but I think the hardest I've ever laughed when I was a monk in Burma was when there was another American monk who would come to hang out with me, or I'd go to hang out with him, and we'd just tell some joke, and that would be it. Like, remember one time he was talking about having a nervous stomach in the shits, and I just said that's actually a good name for a rock band, nervous stomach in the shits. And for some reason we just happened to be in the kind of mood where he starts laughing and then I start laughing, and the next thing you know, we just can't stop laughing. We're like holding our bellies because we're laughing so hard, even though maybe it wasn't the funniest joke in the whole world. It's just you have to be in a certain mood when you're living in a kind of relative sensory deprivation anyway. You're kind of always restrained. Things are funnier. Like, you may recall, like when you're a kid, somebody says something at school, something happens at school, you think it's hilarious, everyone's laughing, then you come home and tell it to your family and they don't laugh, because when you're at school, you have to take everything more seriously, so that when something funny does happen, it seems even funnier than usual. So that would have to be it. I mean, we don't really have time for this, but I could tell you the scariest thing that ever happened. I'd have a relatively good exotic answer for that one, but the funniest thing that ever happened, just hanging out with another American monk and just telling jokes and just laughing our asses off sometimes. Because, I mean, that was, aside from that, I don't know what it would be. because as a general rule, the life of a forest-dwelling monk isn't particularly funny. I'd have to really rack my brains, and we don't have time. You don't want me sitting here for 5 minutes, like scratching my head. Gee, I wonder what... No. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from White Ash Piper. And White Ash Piper says, have you ever heard the one where a Chan monk or hermit left his hut for a moonlit stroll, so a thief enters his hut only to find nothing of value, and just then the hermit monk returns, catching the thief. The thief says, forgive me, so the hermit monk gave him his robe, and the thief left. Naked the monk sits and says, if only he stayed, I would have given him the moon. Poof. And yeah, I'm familiar with the story. In fact, I don't know if this is where White Ash Piper found it, but I found that story in a book called Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, which is compiled by Paul Reps. And it's probably this book that converted me to Buddhism, which some people may find ironic because it's Zen Buddhism and not Theravada, but I was originally interested in Zen. And it's right here. It's not a very long story. It's on page 32. It says, Ryokan, a Zen master, lived the simplest kind of life in a little hut at the foot of a mountain. One evening a thief visited the hut, only to discover there was nothing in it to steal. Ryokan returned and caught him. You may have come a long way to visit me, he told the prowler, and you should not return empty-handed. Please take my clothes as a gift. The thief was bewildered. He took the clothes and slunk away. Ryokan sat naked, watching the moon. Poor fellow, he mused. I wish I could have given him this beautiful moon. The end. So we'll just move on to White Ash Piper's next question. Have you listened to many or any NDE testimonials on YouTube? And NDE is near-death experience. Seems that we really never do die, just dropping out of costumes. Well, I don't recall seeing many, if any, near-death experience testimonials on YouTube, but I have read a lot in books. And so, yeah, I've read books on the subject. So even though I haven't listened to many testimonials on YouTube, if any, I'm familiar with quite a few of them, including John Wren Lewis, who actually had a kind of enlightenment or awakening experience as a result of a near-death experience. He was like this hard-ass atheist scientist who was like president of some atheist society or something. Then he has this near-death experience, and when he comes out of it, he's like Eckhart Tolle. So, yeah, I mean, near-death experiences, they do have certain common features, and, skeptical, materialistic, scientistic types will try to explain them away, but, it's hard to explain away. So I guess I answered that question. Well, it's just kind of a no, because I haven't listened to NDE testimonials on YouTube. So I'll just move on to the next question, which is from Austin. And Austin says, how do you let go of strong attachments such as love? Well, first of all, I would say that love is not necessarily an attachment at all. That really the essence of love is acceptance. But when you accept somebody, it's like this yes, and that's like expansive. It's sort of your consciousness expands with yes and kind of contracts with no, and people get attached to this feeling of joy or happiness or just expansiveness. Also, what is generally called romantic love throughout the world is not so much spiritual love. It's like an animal mating instinct in the human animal. So that has a lot of attachment, and it's very conditional. True, genuine spiritual love is unconditional. But romantic love is always got certain conditions. I'll love you so long as you don't gain 100 pounds. I'll love you so long as you stay faithful to me. That kind of stuff. I'll love you so long as, you communicate well with me, that kind of a thing. So that one of my favorite spiritual teachers who is still alive, I trust, he's getting pretty old though, Paul Lowe, says that when someone says I love you, what it usually means is my neurosis feels comfortable with your behavior. So with regard to Austin's question here, how do you let go of strong attachments such as love? The only way to let go of strong attachments is to perceive them in a different way. That you have to be able to change your perception. So if you change your perception about something, it will change your behavior. But so long as your beliefs and your perceptions remain essentially the same, your behavior is going to remain essentially the same. And if you're attached, you're going to stay attached. So it's like the story I told about my father, where he kept trying to stop smoking. He kept trying and trying. He'd smoke 2 packs a day, and he'd stop, and then gradually he'd start like chewing a little tobacco or smoking a pipe every now and then. Next thing you know, he's back to two packs a day, until one of his legs started turning black. He went to a doctor, and the doctor told him that because of an accident he had had years previously, there was a lot of capillary damage in that leg, and those damaged capillaries were getting plugged up with tar, and that if my dad didn't stop smoking, they were going to have to amputate the leg. So he had to choose. Did he want to stop smoking and have 2 legs, or did he want to keep smoking and have 1 leg? And when it came down to that, his perception changed so radically with regard to smoking that it was still, you still have the addictive urges and so forth, but it was much easier to just say, nope, not going to do it. All I have to do is think about having his leg amputated. And it works that way with regard to lots of things. You don't have to have it just that in your face. Usually you have to learn, maybe through meditation you have an insight, or you just learn more on the subject. It's like maybe you really like fried chicken until somehow you see a documentary about how factory farm chickens are raised, and that just poisons your mind against eating chicken. That actually happened to me. I don't like chicken nearly as much anymore because I've seen these documentaries on how chickens are raised in these factory farms, and it's horrible. It's like where chickens are raised, it's like a concentration camp. It's a concentration camp for chickens. So eating a chicken is practically the same as eating a Jew. So I'll just move on to Austin's next question. He says, so I had asked a Mahasi-stye monk, should we ever attempt one-pointedness meditation on the breath or stomach without using labels? Isn't labeling merely a conceptualization of the experience itself? He has said, quote, your question misunderstands the nature of reality. One-pointedness is only for a moment, and noting is designated for straightening the mind on the experience. The idea of one-pointedness is wrong because the question assumes one-pointedness is longer than a moment. The only one-pointedness you can have is momentary, and the noting helps with that by staying focused on the experience for that one moment that exists, giving you a better relation to the experience. This kind of question makes me think you haven't tried the practice or given it much of a chance, because this is just conjecture and it's wrong. Anyone who has practiced mindfulness for a period of time will be able to tell you it doesn't do what you say it does. Mantra meditation is very powerful, and the only meditation is that our object is something real and momentary, unquote. Thoughts on this, seeing as you have practiced mindfulness? Well, I think this Mahasi monk is just sort of kind of got tunnel vision in favor of the Mahasi method, because, for one thing, he's claiming that when you note something, it helps you to be aware of that moment in kind of one-pointedly. But that's not true at all. By the time you get around to noting what has arisen, you've got trillions of mind moments have already passed. His idea that you're going to be noting an object at the same moment that you are aware of it, that's just wildly inaccurate, which kind of sheds a little doubt on his own insights from meditation. One-pointedness, it doesn't, when it's talking about one-pointedness in the suttas, it's not implying that the one-pointedness lasts only for a moment. That, you're maintaining the one-pointedness. That's you're really good at meditation if you can maintain it. But even one-pointedness, or ekagata, is the Pali version, or the Pali of it, it doesn't necessarily mean one-pointedness. It could also mean just unified. Your mind is unified. In a sense, it's more accurate to say it's unified, because then you're not dealing with your mind being contracted down to this one little minuscule point. It's just unified. So, yeah, I think, yeah, you're better off. I mean, just remember what he said, but don't necessarily consider him to have been like 100% accurate. That he's biased in favor of the Mahasi method. And as a very relatively wise Burmese Sayadaw Ujjotaka told me once, I once asked him, what is your opinion of the Mahasi method? And he said, you can get benefit from practicing it, but it is a limited method. I mean, you're not going to get extremely very far practicing the Mahasi method. Once you start getting up into intermediate levels, you're better off switching methods. That you're not going to get very advanced from practicing the Mahasi method. Or at least that's my opinion. Also the opinion of Sayadaw Mahamyain Ujjotaka. So, yeah. I mean, with regard to the whole question here is, I mean, let's see here. Austin. So Austin asks a monk if it's, you ever get to a point in your mindfulness where you stop noting. And some Mahasi monks will say yes. But a lot of Mahasi monks will say, no, you just have to keep sticking labels onto it, like breathing, or it's like Bende Palde. It's expanding, contracting, like the main Mahasi method is you're observing your abdomen expanding and contracting as you breathe, and that you never stop thinking, Bende Palde, or expanding, contracting, rising, falling. And I mean, it creates, it's like separating you from the experience. If you're concentrating on rising, falling, then you're not really concentrating on what's actually happening. You're at least some of your attention is distracted by the words rising, falling. So when your concentration gets good enough that you don't need to use the labels as a way of like keeping your mind busy and sticking it to the object so it doesn't wander away, when your mind stops wandering away, not consistently, then you can get rid of the labels and just observe the phenomena themselves, and you're getting closer to ultimate reality, going with Orthodox Theravada itself. That rising, falling are not ultimate realities, but the sensations that you are experiencing, according to Abhidhamma at least, according to Orthodox Theravada, are ultimately real. So you're getting closer to ultimate reality by doing away with the labeling. Labeling is like an elementary practice. It may be necessary at first just to keep your mind from wandering away from the object. Because if your mind has got a lot of energy and is restless, you've got to have an energetic kind of meditation to use up the mind's energy. But then when your mind starts getting quieter, then you don't need to keep labeling things. It's just you're just stubbornly sticking to the ABCs instead of moving on to the next level of practice. So, yeah, I wouldn't take this Mahasi monk too seriously. So I'll just move on to Austin's next question. What are your thoughts on Zen? I remember from a previous video that you spoke quite highly of it, even mentioning Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, which happens to be a very good book. Zen appeals to me too, particularly the concept of form being empty and emptiness being form, which I find to be a fundamentally true statement. However, I must admit that I have reservations about embracing the Bodhisattva path. It seems rather dubious and not something I could personally take up. On a different note, I think it would be interesting if Theravadins incorporated some aesthetic qualities inspired by Zen temples. Maybe a Zen Theravada blend would be something quite appealing and beautiful. Yeah, I think Zen aesthetics are largely Japanese aesthetics, just very, this kind of stark, just, wabi tosabi? It's this sort of austere and just elegant simplicity. A lot of black and white. Yeah, I think that might be a Japanese thing more than necessarily a Zen thing. But what are my thoughts on Zen? Yeah, I was originally attracted to Zen until I learn more about Theravada and realize that Theravada comes closer to what the Buddha originally taught. But Zen itself is sort of a return towards what the Buddha originally taught to some degree, because Zen is the Japanese word, the Japanese version of Chan, and Chan is the Chinese version of the Sanskrit word jhana, which originally meant just meditation. So Zen is the meditation school, and it emphasizes this direct experience over all the labels and lists and categorizations and so forth that other schools of Buddhism just wallow in to some degree. So the thing that turned me away from Zen is you read about Zen, like you read Zen Flesh, Zen Bones here, and it seems like these men dressed in black standing around speaking in riddles and occasionally hitting each other with sticks, and that appealed to me. But then I went to a real Zen monastery, and it was all mixed in with Pure Land stuff and all this chanting and bowing and just ceremonies and so forth that didn't appeal to me at all. I've never really been into, I don't want to say empty ceremonies, but just ceremonies for ceremony's sake. Ceremonies just because that's what you're supposed to do. Like in Theravada, you have a ceremony, it has a purpose. It's like the Sangha comes together to recite the Patimokkha, or to ordain somebody, or to like make official a new ecclesiastical boundary, or making confession, that kind of thing. There's always like a practical purpose for it. Whereas in Zen, it's a lot of it is just Zen, just ceremonies for ceremony's sake, and a lot of Theravada. They've got the chanting and that sort of thing that. I never really liked that kind of stuff much either. So I just kind of went alone like the horn of the rhinoceros. But yeah, Zen does accept a lot of Mahayana stuff. It's technically a Mahayana. It's a form of Mahayana Buddhism. So they've got the Bodhisattva concept. They've got sort of the mythological gods and Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and so forth that I really don't have a whole lot of use for. But just the essential practice of it is very similar to the essential practice of early Buddhism, except without so much wandering. They're staying in monasteries mostly, because once you get into China, wandering vagrant beggars they really did not have the same respect that they had in India, and so they had to become like farmers and farm their own food. They couldn't just beg for their food, even silently. So, see, where was I? Kind of lost myself on that one. I was going to say something. Oh yeah, even like Roman Catholicism, that you get into the advanced contemplative techniques like St. John of the Cross writes about, and it becomes similar to early Buddhism in many respects, just the practices of mindfulness and concentration and so forth. So it's like the theory may differ significantly at the lower levels, but the higher up you go and you do less and less thinking, less and less labeling, less and less categorizing, then if they are relatively enlightened systems, they're going to be converging. And Zen and early Buddhism, and even to some degree, some like monastic Christian orders, they're doing the same thing. So, so at the top level, Zen and early Buddhism are comparable. But at the lower levels, early Buddhism, or like Theravada, for example, especially the earlier strata of Theravada, comes closer to what the Buddha was teaching at lower levels. So there is that. So I think I should just move on to the next question, because I really need to answer these questions in a timely manner. And so, Austin's next question. I think we're still on Austin here. Please forgive me if I've misnamed you. I recall you mentioning that you've been to Japan 3 times as a monk. I'm curious about your impressions of Japanese Buddhism, particularly the aspects such as monks being allowed to marry, consume alcohol, engage in cooking and cleaning duties, and following a strict vegetarian lifestyle. Additionally, I'm interested in knowing what kind of conversations or debates you had with Japanese Mahayana monks during your visits. Okay, well, I'll answer the last part first, and that is I never had any conversations or debates with Japanese Mahayana monks. The thing was, when I went to Japan, I was staying at a Theravada monastery in Japan that was it was founded by Japanese people, but they wanted to get back to, early Buddhism, which they equated with Theravada. So there were some Japanese Buddhists who converted to Theravada, and they invited Burmese sayadaws, including one or two Aga Mahapanditas. If you don't know what that is, that's fine. But it's a very high ecclesiastical rank, and they really wanted me to come just because I was a foreigner. I was sort of the example of a non Southeast Asian who successfully had been ordained in a Theravadan tradition or some such. And so, yeah, I just was living in this Theravadan bubble within Japan. And I was very disappointed recently when I found out that the Kamakura Buddha isn't even supposed to be Gautama Buddha. It's one of the mythological Buddhas like Amitabha or something. There's this huge standing Buddha statue in Japan also we went to. I knew that one wasn't Gautama Buddha. I really wasn't that interested yet. But that's just a young monk being kind of bigoted and prejudiced against Mahayana mythological Buddhas. So I need to go over this question a little better here. I'm curious about your impressions of Japanese Buddhism, particularly the aspects such as monks being allowed to marry, consume alcohol, etc. Well, that was it was called the Meiji Restoration, which started in the late 1800s, and the powers that be, including the emperor, decided that if Japan was going to be an industrial power that could compete with the West, they were going to have to become less religious. And so they drafted a lot of monks into the army so they could fight the Russians. And, they melted down temple bells and turned it into shell casings and cannons and stuff. And they secularized the Buddhist monkhood in Japan in order to westernize the country and allow Japan to become like a colonial power like England or France. So that's the reason for it. And the next part of the question here is I just didn't have any conversations or debates with Japanese Mahayana monks, which is just as well, I guess. I really don't speak hardly any Japanese, so I couldn't have done it in Japanese anyway. I did give a couple of Dhamma talks. The first one was very well received, and then the second one, I deviated from Orthodox Theravada sufficiently that the founder of the monastery was very upset, and they were very troubled by my Dhamma talk because I just was too Western or something in my point of view. I wasn't Orthodox enough to suit them. Because there are Buddhists, including Theravada Buddhists, who just cling to the dogma, and to the extent that you deviate from that dogma, you are wrong. And I really don't swing that way. You have to follow your own conscience, follow your own best understanding. You don't have to believe in talking animal stories just because it's there in the book. So I'll just move on to the next question here. How does the Buddhist conception of suffering intersect with existentialist thought and the examination of the human condition? Well, it's interesting that one book that I read a long time ago was by an eccentric English monk named Yanavira, who has probably way more followers now than he did when he was alive. He wound up committing suicide in 1965, but he was an existentialist philosopher. He was talking existentialism throughout, like in his letters, his collected letters. He was really into Kierkegaard, who was proto-existentialist, I guess. He had no use for Karl Jaspers, but he was familiar with him. F.H. Bradley technically wasn't an existentialist, I guess. But, he was just he was into Sartre and Camus and all this stuff. And, he just looked at Buddhism through an existentialist lens. And then what he was doing was he was saying the existentialists are essentially right, but existentialism doesn't lead to Nirvana. It just leads to despair, essentially, or it leads to mysticism. And that's why he hated Karl Jaspers, because Karl Jaspers was an existentialist who turned to mysticism as a kind of a way out of the dilemma of existentialism. And Jnanavira was such an intellectual, such a rationalist. He just hated mysticism. He didn't understand it because a lot of intellectuals just can't understand mysticism because they're just so locked into an intellectual approach that dismissing the intellect, they just couldn't do it. It'd be like dismissing themselves. But let's see. Yeah, so I mean, according to Jnanavira, existentialism is like Theravada Buddhism in many respects, except Theravada Buddhism leads to enlightenment and existentialism doesn't. You just get to a certain point and you just stop in despair. So I guess I answered that one. I hope I answered that one because I'm not going to answer it no more, and I'm moving on to the next question here, which is, how does the Buddhist concept of emptiness challenge essentialist and substantialist views of existence found in Western philosophy? Well, I mean, I assume that essentialist and substantialist views of existence imply that entities are ultimately real, or at least the essence of which they are composed is ultimately real. Sort of like maybe in Spinoza, he had like this, I can't remember what it was called, being or something like that. It was like what mind and matter are both based on. It was like an kind of essence or substance that underlay both mind and matter and were the same. He was trying to unify mind and matter. You know, he was trying to say that mind and matter are just two aspects of the same thing, which was kind of interesting, although I think he wasn't exactly correct in some of his surmises, like that the entire body thinks instead of just the brain, that kind of a thing. I mean, to some degree, maybe, you know, the heart kind of has an influence on the mind and so forth, but I think you could cut off your finger and still you'd have the same amount of consciousness, which Spinoza didn't believe. So, yeah, I mean, how does the Buddhist concept of emptiness challenge essentialist and substantialist views of existence found in Western philosophy? And you just say that, I mean, the essence and the substance are just, they're conditioned and they're essentially conditional. They're not ultimately real. You know, they are dependent upon something else, and when the something else that they are dependent upon ceases, the substance or the essence itself of, you know, what the Western philosopher says is ultimately real or whatever, that also ceases. And even when it hasn't ceased yet, especially if you go with like Mahayanist philosophy like Madhyamaka, you know, it's just virtually real. It's not ultimately real. It's, you know, it's essentially empty of any like inherent essence, at least any inherent essence that you can identify, that you can put your finger on. So, yeah, that's kind of a dense and deep question, and I just do not have time to answer it in full length, especially because there's, I mean, I'm already up to about the 10th question here of, this is Austin, right? Yeah, Austin. So I'll just move on to the next question here. Also by Austin. What insights did you come to in Burma regarding the nature of consciousness, subjective experience, and the mind-body problem? Well, I think one of the most important insights that I had in Burma as a meditator is that when you finally get to the point in your meditation where you're not thinking anymore, you're wide awake and your mind is just clear like glass, that you realize that you're more awake than you were before. Your mind just doesn't stop. When you stop thinking, you know, it's not like you go into a coma. So, I mean, you stop identifying with your thoughts nearly so much when you realize that, you know, there's still, you know, some essence, apparent virtual essence to you that is still there, in some respects even more so when you stop thinking. Let's see, what else? The mind-body problem I really don't see as a problem at all because I don't believe that physical matter is ultimately real. So, yeah, I've probably had that belief since before I went to Burma. So I guess the main insight I had in Burma with regard to what Austin here is talking about, the nature of consciousness and so forth, is that when you stop thinking, you don't stop existing, you don't stop being conscious, that you can just sit there wide awake with your mind clear like glass and in some ways you're more real and more there and more awake and more conscious than you were when you were thinking. That would be the main one. So I'll just move on to Austin's next question. How does the Buddhist concept of emptiness challenge our conventional understanding of identity, individuality, and the boundaries between self and other in relation to right and wrong? I recall D.T. Suzuki making an intriguing statement about World War II regarding the illusion of Maya. He suggested that if one remains entangled in this illusion, perceiving oneself as an agent, the act of killing another person by, say, stabbing them in the eye is seen as morally wrong. However, when one transcends this conventional reality and becomes a passive observer, the perspective shifts. In this transcendent state, the perception changes and the act of stabbing a knife into someone's eye is no longer seen as me performing the action. Instead, it becomes a cosmic dance of phenomena where my knife seems to dance around, and in the intricate choreography of the universe, your eye happens to encounter it. Well, there's a lot I could unpack in this. First of all, D.T. Suzuki, he was very pro-Japan during World War II, and he was endorsing a kind of samurai Buddhism, which probably accounts for him like saying that, if you're in sort of a Zen state when you're stabbing someone in the eye, you're kind of off the karmic hook. But yeah, early Buddhism definitely, the Buddha definitely denounced that kind of thinking. There were philosophers in the Buddhist time. There was one, I don't remember which one it was, who said that you could walk up and down the banks of the Ganges, walk with like a razor disc, like a discus with a razor edge, and just leave heaps of bleeding flesh, all up one bank of the Ganges, and then come back down the other side, leaving heaps of bleeding flesh, just killing everything in your way, and you won't have any bad karma for it. That, it doesn't exist. I guess Suzuki's refining that a little bit by saying, if you have the right mental state, you can just kill people, and you're sort of in a state of like karmic voidness or something. But really, it's sort of like the sociopath I was mentioning earlier, that at deeper levels you know what you're doing, you know that you are causing suffering, or at least that suffering is being caused, and it's the volitions generated by you that are causing that, and it's gonna, there's still karma. You don't just detach yourself from karma. Even an arahant, even though he's not making any new karma, old karma is still there. So let's see here. How does the Buddhist concept of emptiness challenge our conventional understanding of identity, individuality, and the boundaries between self and other in relation to right and wrong? Well, the Buddhist concept of emptiness challenges our conventional understanding of identity and individuality and the boundaries between self and other, and that Buddhism just teaches that there is no self, that a self is conventional. But even so, the universe, the samsaric universe, even if it's not ultimately real, it's a structure composed of karma, like I think it was the very first question, that in a sense you can say the world, the entire cosmos is karmic. So, theoretically possible for an enlightened being. Like some of the stories about Padmasambhava, who was an adept from, like a tantric adept. I think he originally came from India and then moved to Tibet, but he's considered to be like a second Buddha in Tibet, where he would do all this outrageous stuff, eating human flesh, and he would occasionally kill people. Like the one story that comes to mind, he's dancing up on a flat roof, and he kicks a rock, and the rock comes down and kills somebody. And it's like, it was their karma. I'm just up here dancing, so what? And then he might say, because he was an adept, it was this karma that they committed in some past life or something that resulted in their own dying. But, he was sort of absolving himself of any karmic agency in doing that. And, it's conceivable, I suppose, but it's certainly not Orthodox Theravada. And again, I think D.T. Suzuki was making these statements in a way of sort of justifying Japanese soldiers stabbing people in the eye, which they did a lot. They did some really awful stuff during World War II and before World War II. So I guess maybe I answered the question. How does the Buddhist concept of emptiness challenge our conventional understanding? Well, I mean, the Buddhist concept of emptiness is mainly a Mahayana concept. In Theravada, emptiness really doesn't get nearly as much mention. There is just no self, anatta. So, yeah, I mean, anatta definitely challenges our conventional understanding of identity, individuality, and the boundaries between self and other, because there is no self. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Garrett. 2 hours. Man. This is from Garrett. And Garrett says, please pardon any and all ignorance. What are the cons in practicing and ordaining in a Zen tradition? In your archaic Buddhism series, if remembering correctly, the Vyuha Suttas sounded Zen-y. I'm asking this as someone on the path and considering ordination. The Bodhisattva vow seems like the obvious downside, but if that were put aside, what other negatives am I missing? Well, I've already mentioned this to some degree. Like, a lot of Zen has incorporated Pure Land Buddhist elements, and I got no use at all for Pure Land Buddhism. I really do not consider Pure Land Buddhism to have been taught by Gautama Buddha. That is, in some respects, the exact opposite of what Gautama Buddha was teaching. Like, the Buddha was teaching, get enlightened in this life if you possibly can, whereas Mahayana in general, and especially Pure Land, is just saying, nope, don't do that. Just maybe you can't even do that anymore because we're in the Kali Yuga or something. So, pray to this other Buddha that's not mentioned in the earliest texts, that you get reborn in his Pure Land or some such. Also, some of the Zen stuff, like I mentioned before, there's so much chanting and bowing and ceremonies and so forth. It's become very encrusted with ceremony, even though it's like a crust surrounding just this empty, hollow center in a sense. That's in a good sense. I mean, the more emptiness you've got, the better, I think, unless you're just like, you need some kind of substance to occupy your mind. Otherwise, it's just going to be like wandering and just getting lost, going in all directions. So, thinking about being ordained in a Zen tradition, make sure that it's a strict tradition and they really are doing serious meditation. It's got a really wise, like a Roshi, like a teacher there. And yeah, I mean, in some respects, like you're saying here, like some of the really early Buddhist suttas, like in the Atthakavagga, a lot of them read like Zen or Madhyamaka philosophy. You just don't believe anything, don't rely on any kind of thinking, unless, I mean, it's for practical purposes, you're trying to figure out your taxes or something, you have to think, but it's not reality. That if you want to know reality, you have to go beyond thinking and cultivate a silent mind, that kind of a thing. So Zen does have its advantages, and in some respects it can be superior to Theravada if the Theravada places are lax and don't have a wise teacher, and the Zen place is not lax and does have a wise teacher. And the Bodhisattva vow, I mean, I don't know. It's in a way, it's not what the Buddha would have taught, and I don't think he would have endorsed it. That in some ways, Bodhisattva ideas are, it's hard to explain how it arose, other than, I mean, this could be a long digression that we really can't afford because we're already over 2 hours. But I have read that the whole Bodhisattva concept comes from like devotional, early Buddhist, like Theravadan devotional literature, like the Jataka stories, where the Buddha is perfecting his paramis lifetime after lifetime after lifetime over millions and millions and billions and trillions of years to become an omniscient Buddha. And so the natural human glorification of the founder of the religion, which of course in Christianity made Jesus God Almighty, it's it made the Buddha way above like ordinary arahants, ordinary enlightened beings. And so to become a Buddha was seen as superior to becoming a fully enlightened arahant, even though the Buddha himself was an arahant and was obviously exhorting people to become arahants if they possibly could manage it. And the earliest texts have no mention at all of bodhisattvas and so forth. In fact, bodhisattva itself is probably a mistranslation of bodhisatta in Pali or Proto-Pali, because satta doesn't necessarily mean being. It can mean, it's a past participle of sajjati, which means to be bound for, to be, like bound to. So a bodhisatta in the Theravadan sense was somebody who was bound for enlightenment, bound for becoming a Buddha, not an enlightenment being, which doesn't make a lot of sense in a bodhisattva who is postponing enlightenment indefinitely until all beings in the universe are saved, when these beings in the universe that supposedly require saving don't ultimately exist anyway because there's no self. But we don't need to wallow through that. And I'm just going to move on to the next question here, which is from Nirmit. And Nirmit says, is consciousness produced by the brain? If not, then why does people's behaviors and personalities change after brain damage? Yeah, I've discussed this a number of times. And consciousness is not produced by the brain, but it is complexified, organized, and utilized by the brain. Just like electricity isn't created by a computer, but it is like complexified, organized, and utilized by the computer. So the consciousness is not produced by electrochemical reactions in the gray blob of meat, but the gray blob of meat is able to, again, utilize, complexify it, organize it, and utilize it so that it can be used for practical samsaric purposes. And so that explains why, if you get brain damage, part of your mind becomes dysfunctional. To say at least, you can just die. Certain parts of your brain are damaged, especially some of the central stuff, some of the reptile stuff, you just die. But, you get damage to the right temporal lobe and you become tone deaf, for example. Left temporal lobe, you lose the power of speech. The back here in the back, I can't remember what it's called, but the optic lobe, I guess, you can go blind. So obviously the brain, at least in this version of reality, in this samsaric world, it does sort of serve as a vehicle for thinking minds. But a thinking mind is not the same thing as consciousness. That you don't have to, like I was just mentioning with regard to my important insight in Burma, you don't have to think in order to be conscious. The consciousness is already there. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Brambo. And Brambo says, does methamphetamine open up doors to demonic realms, or are these experiences pure hallucination? Well, those two are not necessarily mutually exclusive, because according to Mahayana especially, and I think they're probably right in this sense, even Theravada claims that this entire cosmos is produced by ignorance or delusion. And so when the entire cosmos is created by delusion, it's not a very far step to take to say that this cosmos is not ultimately real. It's a kind of illusion. So ultimately it would be a kind of hallucination, but I really don't have enough experience with methamphetamine to really say for sure from my own experience whether it really can't open up the door to demonic realms. I assume there are, just going with conventional samsaric reality, I assume there are demonic realms. I assume, anything that's possible is out there somewhere. But whether methamphetamine specifically opens up those doors, I've heard that like DMT opens the doors to other kinds of like astral beings and so forth. Maybe, but I can't really say, but ultimately it's all a hallucination, including, us sitting here right now. That ultimately even that is a kind of hallucination. It's not ultimately real. But yeah, with regard to methamphetamine or DMT for that matter, I really can't speak from experience because I've never opened up any doors to demonic realms that I'm aware of. So I'll just move on to Bramble's next question. Do Theravada Buddhist texts speak of Yama or the Lord of Death? Early Buddhist texts speak of the Lord of Death. Yeah, it's like the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata mentions the Lord of Death. But it's probably not the same as Yama, who is sort of like Pluto or Hades in Western classical mythology. He's like the judge of the dead. After you die, you have to stand before the throne of Yama or Pluto or Hades, and then they decide what to do with you or something. Just decide whether you have any special punishments coming, or whether you just have to lurk around in the darkness as an ordinary shade or some such. Yama is one of the main protagonists in one of the main Upanishads, but in Buddhism there are what are called Yama gods. There's a heaven, the heaven of the Yama gods, but they're not judges of the dead. It's I guess they repurposed the gods called Yama. I'm really no authority on like where some of these obscure heaven realms, because it's mentioned almost not at all in Buddhism. Sort of like asuras, where it was like a pre-existing mythology, and the Buddhists had to fit it into their cosmology somewhere or other. So they just put them in the Yama god heaven, and they really don't have anything I know of to do with death, other than I think according to Orthodox tradition, the Yama gods are called Yama gods because they kill like unhappiness or something like that. They're living in a state of bliss, and so all of their unhappiness and dejection has been killed by this living in this heaven realm or something like that. But really, the Lord of Death in Theravada has turned into essentially Mara, who's like the Buddhist devil. And Mara itself means something like killer or death. It has the same Indo-European root as the English words murder and mortal. Mortality, death. So, like a mortal wound is a wound that makes you die, makes you be dead. So, there was the Lord of Death, which was probably like Indian. It was sort of like an Indian mythology, the Indian theology, if we're being more polite, I guess, where, you've got this God that comes and takes your soul and takes you away to the next world, and that somehow metamorphosed into Mara, who's like the Lord of Samsara. He's not just the Lord of Death, he's the Lord of samsaric existence, the whole cycle of birth and death and rebirth and re-death. But with regard to Yama as a god of like the underworld judging the dead, I don't recall seeing it. It might be in there in some obscure reference in the suttas somewhere. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, and this is from another person whose name I can't pronounce. It's spelled Sjors, and I assume it's like Scandinavian or something, where it'd be like Sjors. I don't know. And if you really want me to pronounce your name correctly, you might want to try some phonetics or something, especially the guy in Poland. I mean, that name is just kind of nightmarish. At least with regard to Americans who have to pronounce it. So anyways, Sjors says, I don't know. He says, Yogacara says that the alaya vijnana is the consciousness that appropriates the body. Is it possible that the higher consciousness that takes over in near-death experiences, not sure if it's the right term, is the alaya? Or else, in the Fez edition, you argued, in the Fez edition, you argued that free will doesn't exist, and that a Hindu sage said that the only freedom one has is the freedom of being mindful, everything else running on autopilot, as it were? Is it possible that in such situations the mind realizes that the body controls itself as opposed to ordinary everyday life, when the mind habitually thinks that it is the one controlling the body? I've often wondered myself. Well, with regard to the alaya vijnana, or the storehouse consciousness, postulated by at least one of the ancient Indian schools of Buddhism, it was a way of kind of sneaking in a self or a soul through the back door, and it certainly didn't catch traction with most Buddhist schools. Theravada does not accept it at all, and I'm rather skeptical of it myself. The storehouse consciousness, which is like where your karma is stored, and it's hard for me to swallow. So, is it possible that the higher consciousness that takes over in near-death experiences is the alaya? Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, maybe. I mean, in a kind of conventional sense, it wouldn't be ultimately real, but none of this is ultimately real. The near-death experience itself is not ultimately real. So, yeah, that one is kind of up in the air. I'd rather doubt it. I mean, it might be something kind of along those lines, though. You know, it's sort of like, you know, in Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism especially, they say there's no self in ultimate reality, but conventionally you can say there's a self. Also, there's no soul in ultimate reality, and for some reason, Theravada Buddhists will say, okay, but there's even not a soul, a conventional one. You know, they just put their foot down. They say, you can say conventionally there's a self, but even conventionally there's no soul. And I don't think that that's necessarily correct, as I've spoken so heretically recently about, like when you're in a near-death experience, not the kind of NDEs that were mentioned above, but when you're almost, like one example, you're in a car, you're going too fast, you hit a patch of ice, the car starts sliding out of control, and in my case, when that would happen to me as a young man, my mind would just go crystal clear, I'd stop thinking, and my body would just automatically do what was necessary to keep me alive, and only after the danger had passed would I re-enter, so to speak, a normal thinking state of mind again. I'd start thinking again. But there was just this crystal clarity where it was like some higher power is just controlling your body, doing what is necessary to keep you alive. And then once the danger is gone, then it sort of steps back and lets, you know, the meat puppet take over again. Let's see, is it possible in such situations the mind realizes that the body controls itself? Well, I don't think that it's the lizard brain that's doing it. My sweetheart also hypothesized that this sort of higher consciousness, where you're this state of crystal clarity when you're in an emergency situation, is like the lizard brain taking over. But the example I had when I was like sliding on my back down this very steep hill in the middle of the night in a Burmese forest, it was like I knew to let go of the bamboo pole I was holding, but I kept a firm grip on that candle. And the lizard brain isn't going to be able to think that fast. It's not going to be that aware of the fact that if I dropped that candle, I'd be stuck on that cliffside until morning, holding on to something to keep from sliding down even further. So it's like some higher consciousness, it seems to me. And I think that higher consciousness is always there. And conventionally, it could be called a soul, I suppose. Maybe the Yogacara Buddhists would declare that to be the alaya vijnana, although I don't know enough about the alaya vijnana to really say. But yeah, I don't think it's really the body doing it, because it involves a higher level of consciousness than your thinking mind, than like your ego. It's like something more advanced than that, because your ego just isn't enough. That's why this higher level or this other level takes over. So it could just be like a multi-dimensional consciousness that we're not aware of, our thinking mind is not aware of, just because you can't really comprehend what's higher than yourself. that there are aspects to the mind that go beyond the thinking ego and the intellect and so forth. That it's there, it's just that our mind or consciousness is not limited to the intellect and our feelings and so forth, our ego, what we consider to be our mind. That's just the ego is only aware of just this limited amount of stuff, and there's more to our mind that is beyond that, including like our karma from presumably past lives and so forth. It's there, it's just that we're not aware of it. And there's that's another insight that I got in Burma, is that really there's way more to the mind than you can be aware of by thinking or by looking around and trying to identify stuff. It's just totally beyond that. And as it turns out, amazingly, again, I'm caught by surprise, that was the last question. Of all questions, that was the last one. So I didn't do too bad. It's less than 2.5 hours anyway. And if it's too long for you to watch in one sitting, feel free to watch it in installments or something. I probably won't divide this up into 2 parts because it's less than 2.5 hours. So, I mean, why watch a movie when you can just sit there and watch me doing this? And I do apologize for not wearing the fez at all this time, but it's just the way it is. The fez is going to be for very special occasions from now on. And so that's it. And if you have any more questions, and please, I mean, from now on, just because of the length of the list of questions, try to keep the number of questions down to, let's say, 6 or less. I just gave you an extra added free question. And if you ask more than that, then I may answer them all if there's not lots and lots of questions. But if there are lots and lots of questions and you've asked like a whole long list of questions, I may just pick which ones I want to answer from now on. Up until now, I've been answering conscientiously every single question that people ask, unless it's obviously just like a rhetorical question or something. Or I just don't see it. They asked it in a weird place that I'm not, I didn't remember to look. Like some video that's not a Q&A, they might ask a question there, and then I'm looking in the usual places where people ask questions, and I just don't see it. I didn't look there or something. But if you have questions to ask about Theravada Buddhism especially, or early archaic Buddhism, or about being a monk or living in Burma as a monk especially, that kind of stuff, anything that you think I might know something about, I'm relatively well read. I know some stuff about other schools of Buddhism and Hinduism, a little bit about Western philosophy and sort of parapsychology, psychic phenomena and that sort of thing. All that's fair game. So feel free to ask whatever questions you think in the comments below. If you have access to the Discord server, you can ask them there. If you have access to my Subscribe Star channel, you can ask them there. And feel free to look at the URL links below and subscribe and like if you haven't already, and be happy.